Here I'll give you 5 examples of how to extract text from a cell, from the beginning of a cell as well as from the end of a cell, regardless of how many spaces or separating characters there is in the middle of the cell. Before we start, check the video description and click the link to TeachExcel so you can download the files for the tutorial and follow along. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials. At first, I'm going to show you how to do this using some sort of faux part numbers where the separator is a dash, and show you how to get the first and the last part regardless of how many dashes or sections there are in it. And the very last one's going to be quite complicated. At the very end, I'll show you how to do the same thing using sentences. So I'll show you the very slight modifications that you need to make for the formulas for a regular type of sentence. But first, we'll start with part numbers. Might be a little bit easier to follow. So first off, very simple. Let's get the first 3 letters of the cell. It's going to be real easy. We use the left function equals left. We select the cell with the text, then comma. How many characters do we want to get? Let's get 3. Enter, and we get ASC. Very simple using the left function. Now what if you wanted to get characters from the right of a cell? Also very simple. Equals right, the cell with the text, comma, how many characters do we want to get? Let's get the very last section, so BBB. That would be 3 characters, and we get BBB. Simple as can be. Now let's kick it up a notch. Let's say we want to get the very first part, everything before the first dash. I'm going to go ahead and let's switch these around, put the 2 on here. So it won't always be 3 characters for the first part of the cell. It could be 4, could be 5, could be 6. We just know that we want to get everything that comes before the very first dash. In a sentence, this would be akin to the very first word, everything before the first space. It's exactly the same concept. The tricky part is we have to tell the left function how many characters to get, and we have to do that dynamically. To do that, we use the find function. I'm going to do the find function here first before I put it into the left function. So the find function is going to tell me what position within the cell a certain character appears. So equals find. What do we want to find? Let's find the dash. If this was a sentence, you would find the space. So it would look like this. Here we want to find the first dash. And the find function searches left to right. So find the dash, next argument, within this text here. And we don't need to worry about start number because we want to find the very first dash. Close parentheses, enter. So it tells us that the dash appears in character position number 5. So if we count over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, how many characters do we want to get? We want to get everything before the first dash. So what we do there is we subtract 1. So minus 1, then we get 4. Now it doesn't matter how many characters we have here. It's always going to give us the correct number for the very first part of the cell. So what we want to do, and this, by the way, is a very good way to enter more complicated functions, is enter the little parts of the function separately first, make sure that little part works, and then copy and paste it into the larger function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, delete it, and now let's enter the left function equals left. We want to get text from this cell, comma. How many characters do we want to get? Well, let's paste in that find function. Make sure we have the minus 1 at the end there. Close the parentheses, enter, and there you go. Test it out. Perfect. Next up, let's get the very last word or the last section or the last part of a cell regardless of its length. So up here we got BBB just by telling the right function to get the last 3 characters. But down here we don't know how many characters it'll be. We have 4 right there. We want to get everything after the very last dash. Now I'm going to show you a relatively simple way to do this compared to the very next example. And it's going to work only if you know exactly how many separators you have. So if I know that there will always be 2 dashes in this cell, then this method will work. And it could be 2 dashes, 2 spaces, 2 underscores. anything. But I always know that I want to get what comes after the very last dash, and there are only going to be so many dashes. So in that case, we can use the right function with a few more things put into it. It's going to be a little bit more complex than the last example. So I'm going to start off down here. Let's build the very first thing. So the first thing is we want to figure out how to find the very last dash. Well, in order to do that, we kind of have to double up the find functions. So equals find, we want to find a dash. We want to find that dash in here. But comma, let's go to the last argument, the start number. Where do we want to start looking for that dash? If we don't fill this out or we put something like 1 or 2, it's going to find the very first dash and it's going to return that. That's not what we want. We want it to find the second dash. How to do that? We just put another find function in here. So what is the start number? Where do we start looking for the second dash? We start looking for the second dash after we find the very first dash. So let's find that dash within this text. Close parentheses, but we want to make sure that it starts looking for the second dash after the first dash. So that's why we add a +1. So this is going to find the first dash. This is going to add 1 to that number. So if I hit F9 right now, we can preview that. This will return a 5. And then when we add the 1, it tells the very first find function to start searching for the next dash at the 6th character. And the 6th character comes after the first dash. Control Z to go back to this. So let's close the parentheses, hit enter, and we get 8. So we count 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The second dash comes at the 8th place. Test it out. Perfect. So now we know where the second dash comes. But what we need to figure out is how many characters is the very last segment, the very last part. So we need to get this count right here, the 2BBB. To do that, we can take the total character count of the entire cell. So we count all the characters in the cell, and we minus this number here. So we subtract 8. And that's going to subtract every character from the second dash all the way to the front. So we do len, open parentheses, select this cell, close parentheses, and minus. So len will return the exact count of all characters in the cell. If I highlight that and hit F9, you'll see this returns 12. Control Z to go back. So it should be 12 minus 8, which equals 4. And it shouldn't matter how many characters I have in here or anywhere else in the cell. Now we can go ahead and copy all of this and put it into the right function. So equals right text from this cell, comma, how many characters do we want to get? Let's paste in that crazy formula. Close parentheses, hit enter. There we go, 2BB. Test it out. No problems. Perfect. But remember, this only works if you know exactly how many separators you're going to have. So if I have a third dash in one of these cells, it's not going to return the expected result. So this only works if everything is going to be exactly the same throughout all the cells and you know exactly how many separators you're going to have. How many dashes, how many spaces, how many underscores. Now this is kind of a complex topic, so make sure you download the sample workbook so you can follow along and play around with this until you feel a little bit more comfortable with it. The last example here is going to be how to get the last part of a cell when you don't know how many separators there is. So here we have 4 dashes. In another cell there could be 2 dashes, or 1 dash, or 25 dashes, or spaces if you're doing it with a regular sentence structure. So how do you always get the very last part? Now, this is going to be a tricky formula to explain. So I'm going to try and take it slow, but remember, download the sample workbook, and it's going to make your life much easier. And in many cases, you can just copy and paste these formulas and change the separator from a dash to a space or whatever you need it to be, and you can just plug and play and it'll work for you in your spreadsheet. Before we get started with the last example, I want to show you the full formula so you can see it. It's a beast, and there's a lot going on here. But if you want to skip the explanation, if you don't want to pay attention to any of this, don't want to learn how to use it, all you have to do is to first make sure that you find a character that is not contained within any of the cells. In this case, I've used a vertical bar because that's usually not contained in a cell. However, if you do have a vertical bar, use a symbol that's not going to be contained. It could be the squiggly line or whatever you want. Just make sure it's not in any of the cells and replace this occurrence and this occurrence here with that symbol. Next, whatever you are using to separate the words or the parts of the cell, right here, I'm using a dash. Replace the dash with that. So if it's a sentence and you're using spaces, replace the dash with a space. So you'd want to do that right here and right here. And then the formula is pretty much just plug and play. Just make sure these cell references are correct. So it refers to the cell with the text. And then you don't have to learn how to use it. Just do those three things. Change the cell references, change the delimiter, so here it's a dash, and change the character that should not be found in any of the cells. Now before we talk about the functions, I'm going to try to explain in as simple a way as possible how this formula is going to work. So what we want to do is to get the last part of the cell. It could be the last word. In this case, it's the last part after the very last dash. In order to get the very last part, we have to find the very last delimiter, the very last space, or in this case, the very last dash. We need to figure out where that is, just like in the previous example, so that we can get the very last word. So the way that this is actually done is we're going to first find out how many characters are in the cell. So we're going to count that number. Then we are going to replace all of the delimiters, all of the dashes, with nothing, with just an empty space, so like this. Then we'll find out how many characters that is. Then when we have the total length of the cell and the total length of it without the dashes, we simply subtract that amount and then we figure out how many dashes there are. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 characters. Now if I remove the dashes, leaves us with 12, 11, 10, 9. Now what is 13 minus 9? That is 4. So what that tells us is that there are 4 dashes. Now we use that number, 4, in the substitute function. And the substitute function is going to allow you in the very last argument to tell it which instance of this character to replace. Well, you've just found out that there are 4 dashes. So we're going to replace the very 4th dash with some weird character that is not ever going to be in the cell. And that weird character that we're going to replace it with is the bar. So we now know there are 4 dashes. We've told the substitute function to replace the 4th one with something weird. Now we've got a bar. Now all we have to do is find out the position of this weird bar, because it's going to be the only character like that in the cell. And then we don't have to worry about there being lots of bars or lots of dashes or anything. We've taken care of that problem. And then once we have the weird bar, we follow the same pattern as in the previous examples. We just find out what character position the weird bar is in, and then subtract that amount from the total characters in the cell. When we have a formula, that ends up being this. So it gets a little bit tricky, and I'm going to start inside to out. That's how you analyze formulas. First, let's start with this len and substitute. I'm going to copy that and pull it out. So equals len substitute. Now let's go to the Evaluate Formula feature. It's on the Formulas tab. Click Evaluate. It's going to substitute all of the dashes with nothing. Great. Now let's figure out how many characters that is. 9. Just like we talked about a moment ago. So this tells us there are 9 characters. Okay, great. This right here is what's going to tell us that there are 13 characters. So now we've got our 13 minus 9, 4. Perfect. So we know there are 4 dashes. Okay. And this right here, all of this, is contained within this substitute function. Let's break that out real quick. So we already talked about all of this. And what I'm going to do is to hit F9 key, and that's going to show us a little preview of what that would evaluate to, which in this case should be 4. And you can see how the substitute function is working. First argument, substitute, what is the text that we want to use? Okay, we're going to use the text in this cell. Now, what do we want to replace? Well, we want to replace the dash. What do we want to replace it with? This funky little bar that's not going to exist in the cell. And which instance of the dash do we want to replace? We want to replace the 4th instance. Now let's hit Control Z to bring that back in. Okie dokie. Great. So this is what it looks like now. Now let's go back up here. Go out one more to the find function. And the find function is going to find that funky bar for us. So we have this right here. Substitute. That's what we just talked about. F9 to check it out. Control Z to go back. Let's hit enter. Here we're just going to find the location of the bar. We find out that it's in the 10th position. Next part. Now we just need to figure out how many characters are left over. So how many characters are after the bar? Well, the bar is in position 10, so we just get the total length of the cell again, right here, which evaluates to 13. So then that's 13 minus 10 equals 3. So if I select all of this, hit F9, we get 3. And now you see it's just a simple right function to get the 3 characters from the right of this cell. Control Z to get that back, enter, and that's all there is to it. So it's a crazy formula, and there are a lot of parts to it, and it's a real pain. And even if you know how to do it, if you don't use it for a couple months or even less, you still might forget what you're doing. You still might forget, oh, I need an extra len there or a substitute there. You have the concept okay in your head, but it's a lot to piece together. So I really recommend downloading this spreadsheet and getting this formula and just copy pasting it and playing around with it until you kind of understand how it works, and play around with it until you can quickly adapt it to your needs in the future, and then save it somewhere so you always have this formula. Now I told you I'd show you how to adapt this to work with sentences, and it's relatively easy, so let's go ahead and cover that really quickly. Moving over to the right here, we've got some sample text. All right, let's start with the very first one. To get the very first few letters, this was very easy because we just counted, so it doesn't matter what the delimiter is. And then the very next one, that was also a bit easy, equals right, count the number of characters. However, in this case, there is a period, so account for that. We need to bring in 5 characters. I'm not going to cover how to get rid of the period in this case, because if you have a sentence, you could have a period, exclamation point, semicolon. You could have a lot of things at the end of it. So I'm just going to cover getting the full word at the very end, including anything that is attached to it. Now let's get the first word. Regardless of its size, equals left, this text. Now how many characters do we want? Well, let's find the very first space. So find text within text. Start number, don't care. Now subtract 1, so we do not include the space with the word. There we go, and it doesn't matter if we have anything else in there. Just going to get the first word. Could be longer. No problem. Now let's go ahead and get the last word when we know how many delimiters there are. Let's add another space. The store things. So we know there's always going to be two spaces. In this example, we just want to get the last word. This is where we use the double find trick. So we do equals right here. First, we need to start with the length of the cell, so how many characters are already going to be in it. Then we use minus find. We want to find a space within this text, and we want to start looking for it after we've already found the very first space within this text. We need to add a +1, so it will go after the first space. Close parentheses on the find, close parentheses on the right, and there we go. Remember, this does not work if you have, in this case, more than two spaces. So this is only if you know how many spaces there are. So these formulas here mirror these formulas. The only thing that changes is everywhere we had a dash here, we put a space. For the final example, it's also pretty much going to be the same, but I am going to copy and paste this guy to make our life a little bit easier. Now, the first thing you'll notice is we have an error, so we can fix that very simple with the if-error function. The reason we have an error is because this cell, you'll notice all the cell references updated because they were relative. This cell here does not have a dash in it, so it can't find a dash, so you get an error. We'll fix that real quick just by popping an if-error function in front of it. If you have Excel 2007 or later, you can use that. Otherwise, you have to use the if-is-error deal to solve that. Now we don't get an error. Perfect. Now let's go here and let's replace the dashes with spaces. So 2 changes. Perfect. Gets the last word. Doesn't even matter how many spaces are there. One thing to note when you have sentences is you can occasionally have a space at the end of it that you don't notice. And that will mess up this formula. So to fix that, let's go over here so we can see the full formula. You want to go to the second to last len function and put a trim function around this cell reference. And trim is going to remove any consecutive spaces as well as any spaces surrounding the text. And once we do that, it should work again. So perfect. Now this has to do with cleaning your data as well. You really don't need to account for this as long as you've cleaned all of the data you bring into Excel. So if you import data into Excel on a regular basis, you should have a standard procedure by which you clean the data, make sure there are no erroneous spaces or any weird characters or messed up formatting that is going to mess up the rest of your spreadsheet. But in this case, put the trim around that function and you're good to go for any hidden spaces at the end of the text. As you can see, the formulas start out simple and get complex very, very quickly. So it's very difficult to do something that seems like it should be very simple to do. But the more you work with this, the better you'll get. And I hope this tutorial can help you a little bit. I hope you liked the tutorial. If it was helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And make sure to subscribe and accept notifications so you can see all the new tutorials.